Good afternoon, and welcome to another episode of Coffee Talk, hosted by AABE. And we're here again to give you the energy that you need. We'd like to thank everybody for joining the first episode. We enjoyed that conversation from the worth of your blackness to talking about what's going on with koala bears. I think the koala bears really stole the show. I got so many texts and emails and I had conversations all about koala bears and what's going on with them. Lord bless the koala bears. That's all I say. But for this episode, we're going to certainly shift gears and have I think is a very important conversation. I was having a conversation not long ago about coats of arms. And it came up. Actually, I was at a restaurant when I first learned about it. I saw a guy with a tattoo of this like medieval looking shield, like he was, from back in the Renaissance days or whatever. And so I asked him what that was like, because it looked pretty tight to me, you know what I mean? And then he then introduced me to this whole concept of coats of arms, and I did not have any idea what that meant, had never even heard of it. And so had another conversation where somebody was able to talk about it. And pretty much it's your namesake, right? What's in a name, Shalaya? What is in a name? And so it got me to thinking, right? We got to talking like what is this? So let before to start this whole thing off, Shalaya, do you have any idea where your name comes from, what your name means, and how significant has that been to you?
Yeah. So interestingly, yes, I know a lot about my name, first and last. And so my first name, I'm actually named after a woman named Shalia. But what's more interesting is that when my mother had me in, there's a set of paperwork that you need to fill out to assign a name. She had to call this girl's mother to ask, how do you spell her name? My mom was actually babysitting the girl and fell in love with the name and could never remember how to spell it. And so she named me after her. I've never met this person, but I know that she's just a few years older than me. So that's always good. And then my last name, we sort of carry it in spite of. So my last name is Morissette. And in 1968, when my grandparents, my mother's parents, got married, it was the first year that it was legal for interracial couples to get married in Massachusetts. And his family pretty much disowned him, my grandfather, for marrying a Black woman. And so even my daughter's middle name is Morissette to carry it forward. And so it's just sort of like hey, we're still here.
Yeah.
We're in this bloodline, whether you like it or not. So that is the history of my name. Morissette is quite common. It's similar to Johnson or Jones in the States, but it's actually French Canadian. So that is pretty much the extent of what I know about my name.
Wow.
How about you?
So it is very interesting. My first name. So if you look at my mother's name, actually, me and both of my older brother and one of my sisters, our names are combinations of my father and my mother's name. So my father's name is Richard. My mother's name is LaRonda. So my oldest brother got Richard directly. He's the second. My sister got a combination of their names. Her name is Rashonda. And my name is Lauren, which is the beginning of my mother's name. So after doing some research on my first name years ago, it actually is a bit sketchy on whether or not it comes from France or whether it's French or whether it's German. And because it's very close to the name, the feminine name Lauren. And so, but I actually take more pride in the name Ron, which certainly does have a little bit more history behind it. And then my middle name Monte also is Spanish, and my last name Evans. Now, my last name being Evans, of course, with marriages and husbands dying in war and so forth. and then my grandmother having my father by my father's father, who my father didn't know his father. His last name was actually Stewart. So, but the last name Evans just got carried because that was my grandmother's husband, and so she, of course, all her kids thereafter were named with the last name Evans. So that goes back to Atlanta, my roots in Atlanta, Georgia, where there were certain where the Evans came from. But it's interesting that, you know, genetically, my last name would have been Stewart, but I don't know any Stewarts though. But then the other side of the name that I take a lot more pride in is my mother's maiden name, and that's Watts. And that, of course, goes, history roots goes back to Louisiana, Virginia, and Georgia as well. So little roundabout, if you will, with my names. Uh, but again, certainly still take pride in the last name Evans, because that's what we receive, you know.
Well, I'm excited about my name getting a bit more popular. I mean, it's never been on a keychain or anything, but I do always look for it. But I know that there's an amazing singer. She spells it differently, but pronounces it the same. Shalea, and she's been on Broadway. She's amazing. And then I did find out that it's a small town in the Middle East. So it has been interesting when people try to rename me. Sometimes people think that there's an extra L in my name. I don't know why. Or there's not an A at the end of it. So it's just turned into Shalela, Shalay. Folks have tried to rename me just Shay.
Yeah.
Or Shah. That's my favorite one, which is just the SHA. Just forget all the other letters. It's interesting. I think as a person of color, we put a lot of pride in names, in nicknames. I know that in some cultures you have your family name, right? The one that's given to you by your parents. But there's also like the day of the week in which you were born gives you a common name that people outside of your household call you, which I always thought was really interesting. That you would have a day of the week, right? So you could have multiple people in your family that have the same common name if you're both born on a Thursday. I was born on a Thursday. Don't ask me why I know that, but I know that. And so I would have a particular name. And it's just really fascinating, the human obsession with names.
With names,
like we like to categorize. This is what we do. Our brains like to just name things.
Yeah, so I'm interested to know whether or not you found your name on the keychain yet. I know I have not found mine. So that's well, you know, that's interesting. You know, we need to start a whole keychain business that makes sure that certain names are more inclusive, because I have not seen LaRon. I haven't even seen Ron on a whole lot of keychains. Certainly haven't seen my middle name. You know,
even for Ronald, you wouldn't think so.
Ronald, yeah, which I have an uncle and cousin, Ronald. And interestingly enough, again, my first name is LaRon, but I do go by Ron a lot. And Ron actually is associated with the status of a king. And Monte is translated from a mount or top of a mountain. So when you put my two names together, is essentially a king on the top of a mountain. I said, Lord have mercy, Jesus. But nonetheless,
wow.
Well, I don't look at myself that high. I put it that way. I try to associate myself with lower things.
But I don't look at you that high.
Oh no, let's not do that. But anyway,
whatever. I do what I want. So
yeah, well, thank you. I appreciate it. But again, we putting a plug out there. We are starting some sort of business to make sure that there are more inclusive names, all these little license plate deals on keychains, and you don't never see a lot of the names that we grew up knowing, you know, with folk, this, that, and the other. But you see a lot of the more common.
You sound bitter. You sound bitter. I'm just saying.
Okay. All right. Well,
I think if we just start the business off of like the DMX song and just use all of the female names like LaRonda, Shauna, Shantae, you know what I mean? Just go through that. Start with that list.
All of them. Included all of them. Yeah.
Yeah.
Included all of them.
just list that out first.
Lord have
I think it'll
mercy.
be pretty successful, right? Like, let us know if this is something that we should start, and then add your name in, and we'll put you on the list of keychains that I like it.
Absolutely.
Shalea
Absolutely.
on a keychain would be pretty dope.
There you go.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, there you go.
Um,
Well,
so so we got a chance to talk to Chris Baxter
yep.
about his name, and when you presented this to me, because this is someone that LaRon knows, you said, "Oh, we got to talk to Baxter," and I was like, "Well, who is Baxter?" Because I've never heard that as a first name, let alone a last name. And I was like, this person must be pretty cool to have a name like Baxter, or their parents are even more interesting, right?
Right.
So let's see what Baxter had to say about his namesake.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. So Chris Baxter, vice president here, with me at Burns McDonald, great friend. I would say has grown to be a great friend. I would say mentor too over the years. I've learned a lot. No bad, all good things from Chris over the years, and so just certainly like sitting at his feet, gaining knowledge and different perspectives. And our perspectives don't always match, do they, Chris? But we still
No,
walk away.
that's the beauty of it.
It is the beauty of it. Yeah, it's the beauty of it. So Chris is certainly he's one that you know is over or presides over risk and our risk reviews and making sure that we stay in step with what we need to as a company from a legal standpoint.
I've been with the company. Just started my 35th year. Mechanical engineer. Grew up through the ranks as a design engineer, construction manager, program manager. About 15 years ago, went back, got my Juris Doctorate degree, started practicing law for the firm, and I practiced law for the firm for the last 15 years. Last 6 years, I've been the corporate risk manager, um, general counsel of our international operations, and for a period of time, our quality control officer. So, done a lot of things at the company, seen the company grow from 625 people when I was first started here to over 13,000 now. So it's been an interesting ride. I've been able to see a lot of things and develop a lot of friendships and a lot of viewpoints.
I bet. I bet. Appreciate that. So, Shalea, you want me to give him the spiel and then you're gonna go ahead and ask? Is that how you want to do it?
Yeah. I think so.
Okay. So Chris, so first of all, we started this podcast with the American Association of Blacks in Energy. We started it. Our first episode was in July. We're coming up on our next episode in September. And so one of the segments that we thought would be a good one was a namesake, or what's in a name, and how important it is to, you know your name, know background, so forth and so forth. And so as we were talking about it, she started talking about people she knew, in her area who could, talk about it. I'm like, yeah, I know somebody as well that would be a good person to talk about it. And that's when I thought about you, and we, decided to make sure to invite you to speak in this segment. So I'm gonna let Shalea go ahead and ask the questions, and then you can take it from there.
Okay, that sounds perfect.
Fire away,
Okay,
Shalana.
so let's see. Chris Baxter. One, I'm gonna tell you my name is pronounced Shalea. So think of Princess Leia with a sh.
Shalea. Okay.
Shalea. You got it, right?
Shalea. Okay.
Yeah.
Perfect.
So when Laurent said, let's talk to Baxter, he didn't use your first name, Chris. He went right to Baxter. And I'm like, Baxter sounds like a really dope first name. I've never met anybody. And he's like, no. His first name is Chris, but he goes by Baxter. And I was like, well, that just changes things, right? So the first question I have for you is, do you know the origin of your name, first and last?
I do.
Can you share that?
First name Christopher, which is Cristobal, right? It's a Spanish and Italian descent. Cristobal was, a derivative of Christ, right? And there are a number of different derivations, but it's biblical in that sense. Last name is Scottish English derivative. Mostly Scott on my father's side of the family, but a fair piece of English as well in that.
Okay. So of course I have, two more questions. It was only supposed to be one, but now I have more. Um, would you change your name?
No, I don't think so. I've gotten
Mhm.
used to it. You get this old, there's too many habits. I don't even want to. I still use a telephone number from Philadelphia because I'm too lazy to change it 15 years later, right?
Lord have
There's
mercy.
too many things you have to change to make the name change, right? Just too
Right.
inconvenient.
Oh,
So
too
no,
inconvenient. But
I
I,
don't
I
think.
take that as a woman with the traditional routes of getting married and having to change a name and what that looks like for me. So it is not too much work to change your name. Okay.
Oh no, I disagree. I watched my wife do that, and I felt every bit of that pain because you have to understand. I'm married to a little Sicilian gal, and
Uh-oh.
she likes to share the wealth. Right when she goes through something, she doesn't like to go through it alone. She always likes to make sure I get to go there with her.
Yes,
Right,
I like her
so I get to
already.
feel that each and every. I get every bit of that right as we go. So I totally appreciate the difficulty of that. Now, I will tell you, and I don't know that they were related, but I suspect they are. She won't let me change my cable provider
Mm.
because if I change my cable provider, it's going to cause her to change her email. And that email is what she's given to all the teachers in schools and doctors' offices and
Oh
everything
my
else.
God.
And she does. So I can't change my cable provider because she doesn't want to go through the pain of having to change all that. And I suspect it has a little bit to do with changing her name to Baxter when we got married. So
She's
just
so
Yeah,
saying,
holding you to it. I
I,
love
I
I'm
her
think
still
already.
paying for that.
I love her.
yeah, I
I'm
think
still
I
paying for
understand.
that.
I think I understand what's going on, Chris. It's that Christ and the honor of the one that comes from the Bible. So when she is making you feel what she feels, is the concept of one. That's
There
what
you
I'm gonna
go.
put out there. I don't know her mind, but I'm just put that out there. I think
Well,
that's what's happening.
she is, you can appreciate comes from Italy, so you can appreciate the strong Catholic roots. So I suspect you're onto something there, Laurent.
Yeah.
I suspect you're onto something.
So we have to go back. How did you discover the meaning of your name? Was it told to you? Did you have a personal um, obligation to just seek it out?
So I suffer from suffer from the ailment of curiosity. I constantly probe, and I'm always curious about things. And my dad had a coat of arms that hung on the wall in our house, and I sort of got caught up and was interested in coats of arms and chivalry. I was always kind of a fantasy reader. I used to like reading Piers Anthony and The Lord of the Rings and this sort of medieval, Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, all of this sort of medieval fantasy type stuff when I was a young kid, and sort of the coat of arms, the old European coat of arms, sort of inspired some thinking there, which took me back to why the coat of arms and how did that relate to the name, because the name was always over the coat of arms, right? And what I realized through looking back at a couple of different sources that my name derived largely from two pieces. Um, one, a Baxter was a minor clan associated with the Macmillan clan in Scotland, and then Baxter was a common profession in England and Scotland. Baxter is derived from the word baker. So somewhere back in probably medieval times, one of my distant relatives was the town baker, and that sort of became Baxter, and that's how Baxter derived over the years. And I just I picked that up um, through the study of the origin of the name Baxter. It was interesting. I was able to lock that down though And Laurent and I were having this conversation, I think, one day at lunch, and I
Yeah.
think maybe that inspired this conversation. Um, we had a very distant relative pass away in Charlottesville, Virginia. Distant in the sense that I never met him and never knew anything about him, but under the laws of intestacy in the state of Virginia, he was required. The state was required to locate this man's legal heirs, and he was had never been married, had no known legal heirs. So a law firm was hired by the state to do essentially a genealogy research on this man to carry back into his origins and then carry forward to determine if there were any living legal heirs to this man's estate. And it turned out my father was one of 17 legal heirs to this man's estate. And what we were able to get out of it, my dad got a few dollars out of it. I mean, it was not a ton of money, but what we got out of it that was amazing was this document is about 3/4 of an inch thick that traced my family back into the late 1600s. And then traced my family forward, which was unique because I grew up in a Southern family, and I don't know if you know much about the South. Southern families can be a little chaotic, and mine was very much that way. My grandfather was one of 9 children, um, and my dad was one of 3 children uh, from my grandfather and my grandmother. Now, my grandfather and grandmother got married, but they never lived together. They always lived in different places, and they were always estranged from one another. So my dad was raised with his cousin and his sister, and my dad's brother was raised with his cousin, with my grandfather and uncle. So you can see it's just very chaotic. And my
Wait,
my
Chris, we gotta
grandfather
stop. Time
never.
out. Hold on. Wait a minute.
Yeah, see, there
Okay.
you go.
Wait,
Very
wait, wait,
crazy
wait, wait, wait.
family.
First of all, let's talk about your eloquence of words right now, because you said chaotic. It was a mess, right? Like that's what we call it. That was a mess.
I
So,
you know
so,
I
so wait
accept
a minute.
that I accept that amendment.
Yeah.
Okay? So this, first of all, Tyler, you said that there's a law that is in Virginia for the state of Virginia to spend money and do genealogy tests to trace out
Yeah, they
ancestry.
have to spend the money from the estate. So this
Mm.
man had a
Okay.
relatively large estate, and the state can't just take those assets. The state has to
Beautiful.
make an attempt using the value of the assets to find the legal heirs to the extent there are any.
Mm.
Is that
If they can't
unique to
find
Virginia?
any, then those assets become part of the state.
You said it. Say it
Is
again,
that
Shalaya.
unique to Virginia? That law? Like, is that done across the board, across the nation? Do we know?
I suspect it's not unique to Virginia, but I don't know how many states have a similar law. And it's just an area that I haven't practiced in my law practice, so I don't really know. I learned about that through this particular process.
Wow. I do wonder if it should be something that's across the nation, right? When you consider how many heirs, I think of, you said that your grandfather was one of 9. My great grandparents had 11 children, right? And so you think about, they came from the South, they came from Alabama to
Yeah.
the Northeast. And, my great grandfather had blue eyes. And so that should tell you a whole lot about where he came from. His mother was raped by their slave owner. And so I
Sure.
look at that lineage and to see, given that he is likely an heir to some land that we will probably never know about, right? Because we can't trace it. And so you've got this lovely opportunity to collect on something that, like you said, you never knew this person or how that came about, right? How he sort of like got his fortune.
Yeah.
And so I want to ask you, how much pride does it give you to have a name that you can follow?
Well, pride's an interesting thing because I don't know that there's been a lot of my dad was born in a what amounted to a shack in Portlock, Virginia, up in the swamp. So I don't know that there was a lot of pride associated with those sort of humble beginnings. The flip side of that is because of this genealogical research, we were able to trace our family back into the 1600s, and I think it's my 8 greats or my 9 greats grandfather, a man by the name of Joseph Baxter, actually owned all of what amounts to Currituck County, North Carolina, in the northeastern corner of the state of North Carolina. It's the county that backs up Currituck Sound right across from the Outer Banks. He owned all of that, and he purchased it under a land grant from King George of England. So, you know, there was a lot of money there at one point, and then there wasn't. And pride is an interesting thing. I think my family history, in particular, most of which I didn't know anything about until that genealogical research was done. It's fascinating that way.
Yeah. Chris, I think you mentioned before that learning about the history is what has, helped you. Number one, okay, I recognize, acknowledge what the history was and with my family and so forth, but it's something that you can't change. The history. You may not
Yeah,
agree
well,
with everything that.
you can
Yeah.
you can go to Currituck County, North Carolina to this day, and you will find a little blacktop road called Baxter Plantation Road. You
Mm,
can go to the Currituck County Courthouse, and you can see the property records where my family owned people. You can
yeah.
go. You can go see it. It's there. Uh, it's fascinating history to me as a historian, but I don't know that I would call that pride.
Understood. Yeah.
Well, I mean,
Yeah.
I'm sure there are
Yeah.
plenty of folks that are proud.
God bless their soul.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
God bless them. I can't speak for. I don't know how you can take pride in owning a human being. I that's just where I'm at. I don't know how you can take pride in it, and uh, to me, that's the level and depths of ignorance in that are astounding. Now, I can appreciate it from an historical context. I can sit back and sort of objectively look at the period of time and all of that, but pride's an interesting word. I don't know that you can attach pride to that time period. It is what it is. I think the first time I shared that story with Laurent, I think it took him off his feet, right? Because he's like, "Wait a second,
Well, yeah.
I'm looking at you in the face, and like you're like just laying out this matter of fact." And I'm like, "Well, what are you going to do? Are you going to hide from
Well,
it? I mean, it's the
right.
truth."
Right. Right. And I love the fact that you acknowledge that, and I think that's what I appreciate it so much, and even still appreciate now about a conversation. And I think what drew me into it was even more was when you said that there were black Baxters, and I was like, wait a minute,
There are a lot of there are a lot of black bag. In fact, I would venture to say, particularly in the southeast, there are more black Baxters than there are white Baxters,
wow.
which is a very common characteristic because what happened was you had a family move into the South, right?
Mm,
The predominant population in the South, particularly pre-Civil War, pre-antebellum, was disproportionately black. There were a lot of blacks relative to the number of whites. The density of whites was relatively low in the South. That didn't start to change until after the mass migrations through the early 1900s during the Industrial Revolution. Um, but what would happen at the end of the Civil War, right? You had all of these African Americans at that point in time. Most were not African. They'd been in the country for generations. Some over 200 years,
right.
right? So multiple generations. Uh, they had an African heritage, but they were Americans,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
But they weren't given the dignity to have a last name, but they
And
needed a last name, and so
yeah.
most took the last name of what they knew, which is the plantation owner or the plantation or the region of the country that they were in, etc. And that just complicates, Shalea, the point that you were making earlier about how difficult it is for you to find your genealogical history, whereas mine is obviously a lot more documented, even when I didn't know it existed.
Hmm. And I think one of the things, and I know Shalea's probably like ready to ask 1,000 questions, but I wanted to ask you one of the things that you share with me, because I love the opportunity to learn about that genealogy and so forth. And I think I was sharing with you, just as Shalea shared earlier, her family history goes back to Alabama. Her grandfather's eyes were blue. And I know my grandfather, his family history goes back to Louisiana. And I've even seen in the ancestry records where his great grandfather is listed as mulatto. And you can look at my grandfather's legs today, and they look like you, Chris. You know what I mean? So, or they look like and so,
Absolutely. Hey, look, the
and
reality is that the genetics,
right,
the genetics became blended in many cases
right,
through several hundred years of I'm going to use a term is probably not very fair, but coexistence, right? And oftentimes very unpleasant coexistence for the African American people who were in those situations.
yeah,
Rarely you had something that may have been uh, maybe less forced, but I think probably more common. It was the experience of your family, Shalaya, about the rape um, and the abuse.
yeah. So one of the things I wanted to ask was, I think you had mentioned, in order to attempt to get, I think, an accurate or better capture of the genealogy as far as history goes, is to mark the year 1776. I think is what you had mentioned, just because that was the year of when America really became America, and when documents, or there's a possibility that documented information about Americans or Black Americans really go back to that year. I think, weren't you mentioning something like that? Yeah.
So let me give you my take on that. Right. So historical dates are interesting because they're picked in order to start something. But the reality is, what happened in 1776 was the beginning, not the end, right? What happened in 1776 was the start of an active revolution in response to the events in Massachusetts in 1775. America didn't really exist in the way that we think of it today until 1789, right? But what I will say is that most records for African Americans were very scant uh, until after 1865,
Mhm.
right? Because you know you can look at the Dred Scott case to get a sense of what the feeling in America was, right? At that time, and that was generally speaking, African Americans weren't people; they were property. And so why do we worry about naming them any more than we name our pets? I mean, it sounds, ridiculous to say that today, but I really do believe that, I don't know how familiar you are with the Dred Scott case, but it was a landmark Supreme Court case where the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court declared that Africans were property. Right? It was one of the many precursors to the Civil War. Right? It was one of the things that caused John Brown to literally come out of his skin and start to raise hell over here in Potawatomi, Kansas, and then ultimately in Harpers Ferry, Virginia, West Virginia, what we consider West Virginia now, but it was Virginia at the time. So that sentiment caused people to really to sort of really disregard people, and then you had the period of Reconstruction. There was a short period shortly after the Civil War, maybe 8 to 10 years of Reconstruction, where you had a number of different things. One of the things I often have fun doing, because I'm a little bit of an amateur historian, is I like to talk to people about when was the first Civil Rights Bill, right? And most people wrongly assume that it was 1960s, The first civil rights bill was in the 1860s and 1870s. Okay, it was immediately following the Civil War, and it was passed overwhelmingly by the Congress of the United States at that point in time. Now, what you have to understand is that the Union Army occupied the South as an occupying force throughout the period of Reconstruction. So that Union Army created an environment where all of a sudden we started getting black mayors and black congressmen and black representatives, and these people started to pass laws and create businesses and do really fantastic things. And then by the time we got into the 1870s and the early 1880s, I think there was a general change in the energy level, one, to continue to have an occupying force in the South. I think the North, like most Americans have always done, they sort of get tired of having the troops in Iraq, so they send our troops home, right? And it was the same kind of thing back then, right? We want our kids back in Ohio and New Hampshire. We don't want them to be down in Alabama and Mississippi. Well, as soon as those occupying forces went away, the sentiment and the mentality of the people in the South didn't change. It had just been suppressed. As soon as it went away, we got Jim Crow.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden you started to see the South actively pursue things. And what's really interesting is when you look at Plessy v. Ferguson, which is a really very famous case, I don't know how familiar you guys are with it, but this happened in the late 1880s, or maybe in the early 1880s. I forget the exact year. But Plessy v. Ferguson was a situation where there was a man, just like you're talking about your grandfather, your relative, Laurent, who could pass white, but was truly African American. He had that situation where the dominant gene in his body was the white gene, so his skin was white, even though his parents were African American, right? Somewhere along the way, he had a white gene dropped in there, and so he passed as white. Well, he got on the train and then announced that he was African American. They said, well, you have to sit in this other place. And that's what started the whole separate but equal. It went all the way to the United States Supreme Court. The United States Supreme Court said separate but equal is perfectly legit. So until Brown v. Board of Education, we have separate but equal, which facilitated all of the Jim Crow laws in the South. And what people like to talk about is, well, that's what was happening with the South. Okay. But, Lauren, you and I've talked before about redlining.
True. Absolutely.
Redlining didn't happen in the South.
Right.
Redlining happened in the North.
Yeah.
And it happened in the North for the same reasons under Plessy v. Ferguson, separate but equal. Right? So anyway, I've kind of rambled on, but that's my take on that.
Yeah.
Valuable information. But I've got to go back to ask you, when you learned all of this, you learned that your family at one point had slaves, right? Was there any part of you that said, oh my gosh, I don't want to represent this. Maybe I should change my name?
No.
Okay.
I read a quote recently. Ours is not to alter what our history was. Ours is to understand what our history was, to recognize it for the correctness or incorrectness that it was, and endeavor to do better. To mask that is to lie. I'm going to change my name. Have I changed my blood? Have I changed my heritage? Have I changed my grandfather? Have I changed my DNA? No, I've just hid from the truth. And the truth is that was a heinous period in world history. People like to talk about American history because they don't understand that it's world history. That what was going on in the United States in the 1810s and the 1770s was no different than what was happening anywhere else in the world at that period of time. Slavery was a widespread practice, not just African slavery, but slavery all over the globe, Middle Eastern slavery. There were tons and tons of whites enslaved in Africa. in northern Africa. So I mean, it's just slavery as a practice since biblical times has been a heinous abuse. But we're going to hide from that and pretend like that wasn't us. Like, why? Right? That doesn't teach our children how to behave differently. Right? It doesn't teach our children, look, you were part of this. Don't pretend to be holier than thou. You're not. This was in your history. Own it. Stand up and do right by it. Right? Not to run from it. And so that's my view. I don't know if that's correct or not, but that's my take.
Wow. Man, I could spend all day talking to Chris, just full of stories, full of good knowledge, full of history. Appreciate him always. So we also got a chance to talk to another brother. Shalea had been telling me once we talked about this topic, this episode, she kept bringing up, oh man, we got to bring Latif on. We got to bring Latif on. So we also got an opportunity to hear from Latif Olajide, whose roots go back to Nigeria, and he had a lot of good perspective to share on this topic. And so let's check out what Latif had to say about this topic of a namesake, or what's in a name.
So today we're here with Latif Falorin Olajide from Rhode Island Energy. He is the lead technical inspector there in regulatory compliance. And I will let Laurent take the lead on this, and let's get started with asking our questions.
All right, Latif, man, good to have you. So
Pleasure
yeah, absolutely, good deal. So your name is Latif Olajide. And I'm curious to hear and understand. Do you know the history or the origin of your name, first and last name?
Yes, I do. My mom has told me this in the past. Latif, my first name is Arabic. My background is in Islam. Both of my parents are Muslim, and I grew up in the mosque. So Latif is my Muslim name. My middle name, Falarin, which is of Yoruba origin, a tribe in Nigeria, it means walk in glory. And that's actually what my mother calls me. She calls me Falarin. Yes. And Olajide, my last name, is also of Yoruba origin. And that name means wealth has risen. So that is the meaning of my name.
Okay, so each name has a depth of meaning, sounds like, but then also it sounds like there are some different aspects of origin as well. So one, you mentioned Islam, but then you mentioned Nigeria. I didn't catch that last one with your last name. What did you?
It's
also Nigerian.
It's
Okay.
also Nigerian.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Latif, my first name, means the subtle one.
Ah.
So in Islam, there are 99 names that you refer to God, Allah, and one of them is Latif, and it means the subtle one. So normally when you speak of a descent, once you speak of a follower of Islam and you use a name, you're supposed to put Abdul in front of it, meaning the servant of Allah, because one of the names of Allah is Latif. So, we dumb it down for America. It's a little much. But if I was to go to the masjid, they would call me Abdul Latif, servant of the subtle one.
Gotcha.
As one of the names of Allah, and it's a privilege to have one of the names of Allah. So that's the basis of it.
So how early were you taught the meaning of your names? That being from your first to your last name.
Well, my Yoruba names, I didn't learn that until maybe I was a teenager. I never really asked. I did know it was different. I knew that, my peers around me, the ones I grew up with that are Nigerian, we all had these unique names from where we are at this present moment. We grew up in Providence, Rhode Island, and our names are extremely unique. A lot of people don't have those names unless they may be Nigerian. So I always knew it was different. I always knew it was culturally different, but I never knew the exact name of it. And when I did learn, I did find a lot of power in it. I like the meanings of them. They sound very pristine and sounds like something that it's very there's a lot of strength in
Yeah.
the names, you know. So
Okay.
that's how I felt about it. Teenager, to
Yeah,
answer your question.
okay, yeah. I was curious. I'm like, man. So let me ask you this: would you? Is there any reason that you would give up your? I mean, you just talked about probably a unique experience for yourself and some of your other peers. You know, growing up in Rhode Island, knowing that your name is different and so forth. So I was sitting up thinking about that, like, wow, you know, there might be some challenges, or could have been some mental challenges, if you will, or fitting in or whatnot. But I'm curious to know, is there any reason that you would give up or change your name? And if so or not, I'd like to also hear why.
No, I would never.
Okay.
I find a lot of power in my name. I like the fact that it is unique in a place where a lot of people don't have it. So I already stand out immediately. People want to look at that and, you know, they can make their own judgments of it. But once they speak to you, they have to learn who you are. And then your name becomes even more strong to them because, like, oh, he's just a nice regular person. And now, you know, it's Latif. You know what I mean? It's the only person with the name in the area, or whatever the case may be. And I always like that. I always like that people can refer to me as that and not think, you know, of another person. Yeah, when you say Latif, you're thinking of me, where I'm from. So I always like that part of it. It wasn't always this way. Elementary school and middle school were extremely hard for me. I was a shy kid. And, you know, whenever they say my names, a lot of jokes come up. And so, you know, I wish I had a name like Tim or Tom back then. But once you hit high school and college, it becomes cool to be unique. You know what I mean? It's the melting pot. So now people are interested in you. They want to know why your name is different. They know that you have a different culture. It makes you a lot more interesting. So I think it's a blessing, honestly.
Yeah. So let me ask you: Do you make sure, or do you make every effort to make sure that people are properly pronouncing your name? Because I'm sure that you've come across that challenge as well, with it being as unique, with it being from, you know, or with it being Nigerian and so forth, and Islam, or Muslim rather. And so, do you find yourself, or have you found yourself having to make sure that people pronounce your name right? And if you do or have done that, what are some of those reasons?
Well, honestly, I feel like it's in their best interest that you do have them pronounce your name right. You wouldn't want them saying your name wrong, or anybody's name wrong. It's like saying a word wrong. Like you will want to say it correctly. So I don't take it any way when somebody says it incorrectly because they're not used to it. I would just go ahead and correct them, and then from there on forward, even if they keep messing it up, I'll just keep correcting them. They're obviously not used to it. So but I always correct them though. I'm not gonna let them say my name wrong. I usually don't. I don't come across too many people that say it wrong. To tell you the truth, Latif it's phonetic, so it's pretty easy to say. My last name, there's little hiccups at the end of it, but it's still not the hardest name I've come across, even in my culture. So I usually don't deal with too many struggles with that.
Yeah. And so,
you know, I have a billion questions, right?
Yeah. Fire off, Shalay.
So
Fire
just
away.
for like educational purposes, and as we're talking to our audience, your last name, is it a common last name in Nigeria? And is there significance when you meet anybody else that has the same last name?
So Olajide is a common name. It's actually a common first name in Nigeria. Just happens to be my last name, but that name is a common name if you go to Nigeria. Olajide. Also, you know, you kind of always can tell or use kind of context clues when speaking to a Nigerian or hearing the name of Nigerians because there's prefixes and suffixes, right? So you have Folarin, for instance. Fola is a prefix for men and women. Like my mom's name is Folake. My name's Folarin. So you have Olawale, Adewale, you know, Ode Tunde. So Ode, Ade, Fola, Olu, Ola. These are all prefixes, and it's pretty much unique to Nigerians. So a lot of people can identify, or I can identify most of the time a Nigerian if I hear those kind of names by the prefix and suffix. So the name could change. It could be Olawale or Oluwale.
Right.
You know what I mean? But we would end up just calling him Wale. So that's an interesting thing that I knew that without anybody telling me that, just by being around Nigerians in my whole life, So that's an observation, and that's something I could pass along as far as
So I'm
my
going to
culture
give
goes.
you, when I first met you, and in my lifetime, I've acquired a ton of friends that happen to be from a country in Africa. Doesn't matter where, but I get a sense of pride that they carry in particular. And I attribute it somewhat to they know their namesake. They know the origins of their name. And you and I have talked about this, that do you ever see the difference in the way that African American carry their name versus those that are coming from a lineage that they can trace to Africa?
Yeah, I could say I could see a difference, but I think it has a lot to do with the name, right? But the name is attached to the culture they're from. So I think they find a lot of pride in their culture. Because even in America, you can have somebody that has a last name, they carry their last name, and they hold it strongly, whether it's a Smith or whatever the name is, it's their lineage. So if they have a powerful family, they might have that and hold that tightly. But as far as my culture goes, I think when Nigerians they really covet their names because it ties back to their culture. Not just Nigerians, like you said, it's other cultures and nationalities within Africa, even outside of Africa. So I think that's what it all boils down to. It's kind of just having pride in your ethnicity. Mm-hmm.
So I have found
I didn't know.
that
So I was about to say, 'cause I didn't know.
No, you know me. I'm gonna throw it, and I know I'm just thinking about how many times I have to correct people. You mentioned that your name is phonetic, right? And so sometimes I give folks the option of shortening my name if they ruin it too much, right? Like I don't want to keep hearing my name just railroaded in a horrible way. What is your stance on people shortening or sort of renaming you so that they don't mess it up?
I can't be one to judge somebody that wants that to happen, because they're the ones who have to deal with that every single day. And if it's something that they're just tired of correcting people, or they're just trying to fit in, I wouldn't judge them on that. I just feel like everybody's different. Their threshold for withstanding someone saying their name wrong over and over again, everybody's threshold is different. You know what I mean? So I think they should still find pride in their name. That doesn't necessarily mean that they don't when they shorten their name. The only thing I don't like is when people let somebody just call them a whole nother name. Like, I don't know. I'm trying to use an example, but their name would be something unique, and then they'll call them Fred because it's spelled like in that area. I just don't like that. I don't like when that happens. If you find a nickname for them, cool, but don't try to make it an American name or something like that just to fit in. Still keep some elements of who you are. So I know Shalaya, sometimes we call you Shay Shay, but it's Shalaya, like it's still, they're not calling you Sharon.
Right.
You know what I mean? It's different.
Right.
It is very different, and I probably would not allow anybody to call me Sharon. Go ahead, Laurent.
I know that's right.
No
Yeah.
way.
So you just mentioned something as far as calling you an entirely different name. And so, of course, and you also have shared, and I know Shley brought up, the fact your family, maybe within the recent century or whatnot, came over from Africa, can trace their lineage or whatnot back to Africa, where you have a large population of blacks or Black Americans and whose origins do go back to Africa, but of course they can't trace their lineage or genealogy back there from a documented standpoint, and even to some extent, not even, or a large extent, not even from a word of mouth. And so, how do you reckon with the stripping or the complete renaming of the larger population of Black people in America? Is that ever a conversation within your culture, and is there a perspective that you have on that happening?
That's a great question. With me, I feel like, I feel like I speak from a place of being blessed. I think I'm blessed the fact that I'm first generation American. My parents came from Nigeria to make a better way for themselves and for their kids, future kids. They moved before they had kids, and I was brought up in a whole different culture. Where there was a lot of pride in that culture. It was different. I was raised very different from my peers. My parents were a little more strict. They speak another language. We eat different food. We have different customs. And, at first growing up, as a kid, you always just want to fit in. So you always try to kind of like shun those things. You think that it's kind of a bad thing because you're so different and you're standing out. The older you get, you start to realize the power in that. And as far as going back to the names, as African American culture, I feel like that kind of is what would be missing because African Americans, Black people in general, are extremely strong. We're the strongest people on this earth. But this country likes to break us down. They like to make us feel less than, and we have to ingratiate ourselves in their culture. It's their culture. You know what I mean? So they're the ones with the power. So at the end of the day, I feel like even subconsciously for me, my parents not being from here, not having to go through a lot of the torment that's passed down. It's a real thing. It really is a real thing. That's my observation. There may be no truth in it, but to me, I feel like that's what a lot of the dichotomy is. Like that's a real thing. That's when you try to look back, you're dealing with your everyday, day-to-day problems, somebody calling you the N-word or whatever. Somebody call me the N-word, I'm not going to get mad. I'm not. I don't feel that way. I don't think you can't make me feel no different. I know I'm powerful. That's just a word. So you're trying to demean me with that word because history told you that word is something that is going to strip us. You know what I mean? We give it power. So, and my ancestors weren't called that. It's never happened. You know what I mean? So I think there is some power in that as well. But that doesn't make I feel like a lot of Africans or any descendants that come here, they feel like they're better than because of that. And I feel that that's the wrong way to look at it. I feel like we can identify it and then we can come together to strengthen the whole community because we're all from the same place at the end of the day. Somebody came in, disrupted that, and now caused this problem. You know what I mean? So it takes acknowledging it first. It's a tough conversation to have. It takes acknowledging it first. You always have to have acknowledgement before fixing a problem. So acknowledging that, and then deciding what you want to do with that information. Either you change your name, or you even make your name stronger, or you just know the power behind what's going on with your lineage, and going forward, your people will be better. Your family will be better because of it. So, but it all comes down to information. It all comes down to education, and it all comes down to how you react to it. So that's how I feel about it. That's how I feel about it. So I do feel like there is a difference, but it doesn't mean that it can't be something that we can work together to fix. We're all still the same people. We still have to be in this country and deal with the same racism. We still deal with the same, lack of resources and everything else of that sort. So it's just how you react to
Yeah.
it. 'Cause Africans deal with it, and we react a little
Yeah.
different to it. You can't stop us. We just feel like you can't stop us with that. Just scoff at it. We work
Yeah.
harder. So that's just how it was. Just a mind state.
Man, you said some good stuff, boy. I'm ready to. There was a comedy, a Def Comedy Jam years ago, back in the '90s, and there was a comedian who talked about the closeness that we may have some differences. Yeah, you may have come over and migrated over. My ancestors may have been enslaved and brought over, but our roots are really the same, and our physical identities are very the same. So he our attributes,
Attributes.
absolutely. He brought up the fact that if the cops pulled us over and me and Latif, me, you, and Shalea are all in the car, and of course it was in a context of the '90s, and he said if the cops said you N-words, get out of the car, you're not going to look at me, hey, talking to you because of your American experience, you know what I mean? You get out of the car and Slade, if they see us, even though you may have come from Nigeria and that is said, they'll refer to every last one of us, you know what I mean? And so, but I think you were so on point when you talked about the power we give it. I was given a saying, my pops told me the saying years ago, know who you are, because if you don't know who you are, anybody can name you. And if anybody can name you, you will answer to anything. And so I think that certainly aligns with what you talked about, giving the power. And yes, you're right. There are some differences, and some who are from Africa do come over with a bit of maybe a little bit more of a pride that they don't, and they haven't had the conversations to really connect, like you said, on some of that the information. But I do agree with you that if we come together more on that, talk about it, and decide and determine ways in which we can actually strengthen and empower one another, man, it would just be so powerful. So yeah, that's good stuff, man.
Okay, so wait, I still have questions.
And it's funny that you mentioned that because
I still have questions. Wait. So I need to know. You have a very unique name. I obviously have a very unique name. Same with LeRon, right? You don't have children yet. I know this personally about you. Do you plan on, are you considering when you do have children to give them a Nigerian name?
So my fiance is Haitian. So I know she's going to have a lot of say in that. But I would like for one of the names to definitely be a Nigerian name. The last name already is going to be Nigerian.
Smart man.
But middle name, first name, I would like it to be
very smart man. Compromise.
Yeah, being
Beautiful.
proactive already.
Compromise.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so wait, I still have more questions. And one I'm really thinking about for you is, LeRon, you brought up the story of like if we were all stumped. I know that you're first generation American here. Was there any point in your lifetime that you realized that you were what I'll call regular black, right? That there was no differentiation between you and someone that was born here as it relates to career or your personal life, walking through life? Was there a realization that there's no sticker on my head that says I'm an engineer, that I'm Nigerian, I'm not from here? You see me and you just see a black man, and I will suffer the same consequences as a regular African American.
Yeah, actually, that's what I was about to speak on. Sometimes, and it would be even more for my parents, right? Coming down here, they may be looked less than any black person in this country because of the accent. You know what I'm saying? So, for me, I grew up American with the Nigerian custom, so I still am very different from my parents. I still understand, the struggle and some of the struggle and the dichotomy that comes with being African American in America, or having a longer family line in this country, right? So I would understand more than my parents would. You know what I mean? Because I'm growing up in it. But I deal with the same things. I've learned that I just handle things a little differently because and I think there's a reason for that as well. So when I get pulled over, I think there's something to this. I should write like a pamphlet on it because it keeps working, right? So when I get pulled over, for whatever the reason is, I always speak to the cop with respect. I always tell him what I did before he says it. And they always let me go. Every single time. This happened at least 7 times in a row. I can't
Did you
even,
say
I don't even
7
know why.
times, Latif?
But I think
Did you say 7 times? Okay, I'm
at
gonna need you
least
to stop getting pulled over.
not one ticket. No,
Well, you
no, because I have 10 on my car, so I'll just tell them I have 10. They might have put me over for some
Got
other
Mm.
reason. I wasn't even doing anything. But I'll just say something, so they're always looking for us to be ultra, uber aggressive. And there's a reason why we mostly, African Americans that have been here and their families have been, treacherized by these people for centuries. There's a reason why they would be uber, disrespectful or just assume that they have to be that way when you stop them because they automatically thinking it's because I'm black. Even if that's the reason, there's a way that you can handle it. Even if they did give me the ticket, I would still not feel bad about handling it that way. Oh man, I should have just called them and
Right.
whatever and kept it moving, right? So there's a lot of anger in that too, that I necessarily don't feel that, to tell you the truth. I understand it, but I don't feel it. I can't feel it, until something happens to me or my family per se. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But
That's a different perspective.
we still, we
right, yeah.
still get still look at us like any other black person. They wouldn't know the difference until you start speaking. And I'm not even saying that it's because I'm Nigerian. There's black people that would handle it the same way and probably have the same result or different results. You know what I mean? I'm just speaking from why I choose to do that. And I think there's something behind it. I don't have that anger behind me. I never lived a street life either, so I'm not somebody that had a lot of disdain for cops because they weren't bothering me and I wasn't bothering them, But I know that's different for a lot of people. They could just be walking down the street to school and have a problem with a cop just because they're black. You know what I mean?
Yeah, just the constant bothering. I mean, I think you brought up a good point earlier when you talked about, well, you clarified when you said that you can't know what it feels like unless something happened to your family. And I do agree that, if you had that constant bothering, not necessarily even of yourself, but of a family member, at some point it can build up, especially when you're young. I mean, because I experienced it when I was 19 or 20. I had a cousin that was killed by the cops. And when you're young in mind, it can definitely build up quick, and you've experienced things living here all your years, right? And you've been told the history from your grandparents and grand uncles and aunts and so forth. So when you see family members experience it, and those things are passed down, I hear you. Then that's when, and I hope and pray that doesn't happen with the generation of Africans who have come over, and did not get that history of treatment, in America. I hope that is not a story that your kids will tell in the next 20, 30 years. You know what I'm saying? But I do think it can if people are bothered enough. You know what I'm saying? Yeah.
Absolutely.
So I would say, Latif, thank you for joining us. This was really impactful, and I think people need to understand that there is a difference, but there is a bunch of commonalities. The next question that I really have for you in this episode, a part of the segment is talking about the use of energy in prisons. So prisons are the number one consumer of commercial buildings for energy, right? Exactly. And so I need you to put on your civil engineering hat as you think about this topic. One, as a Black man, given that a huge population subset of Black people are in prison, right? They are consumers of this energy, right? But prisons are not exactly set in cities, right? So they're taking you away from the city normally, right? When you think about a federal prisons are usually in very remote places, middle of nowhere. And so you think about how do we, one, reduce that load on our grid? How do we take that energy and do something innovative with it? How do we sort of full circle affect this population of Black men and women that are in these prisons as it relates to energy?
Yep, for sure. The infrastructure that has to be constructed. So not only the operation, but even the construction of those facilities is a large investment. And so you pile that up on top of the operating expenses is just amazing. So when you think about some of those, this is according to a website, Future Energy Solutions, and the cost of running a correctional facility is $31,000 per inmate per year. $31,000 per inmate per year. And in some states, it can be up to $60,000 per inmate per year. Not only that, but according to prison policy, as not only that, but the Federal Bureau of Prison Statistics, there are over around 2.3 million rather people that are currently in prisons, and there are 1,833 state prisons, 110 federal prisons, 1,772 juvenile correctional facilities, 3,134 local jails, and 218 immigration detention facilities. And so, and the thing, when from an energy consumption standpoint, these prisons are operating 24/7, 365. So when you take in those statistics too and consider the stat that Shaled mentioned as far as it being the number one consumption of facilities.
That is it's I didn't know that, but I'm not necessarily surprised. I know a lot of money, a lot of government funding, a lot of private funding goes into these prisons. It's legal slavery, honestly. So people, companies, they're getting a lot of labor done for low for low wages or no wages. So as far as energy is concerned, it literally has to come back to the constituents. It has to come back to us making this a bigger issue to the people in power, to the politicians, and making them aware that we know this, and we're paying for it as taxpayers mostly, and we don't want our money to go towards that. We could use that energy for lower income residential areas, or small businesses, or if we can get some grants out or something like that. Maybe they need to limit the energy use. Maybe they don't do 24/7. Some of the programs they have going on there where they need so much of this energy has to be limited. And I would need to know a little bit more about why it is so high, but I think it is because of the whole 24/7. There's so many inmates. There's something going on all hours of the day, or every single minute in these prisons. That is a very alarming.
Well, you have to remember, right? Like the usage comes from having an infirmary, right? Like having a dedicated place for if there's an emergency, and then there's just baseline security of the facility. So security has to be up and running.
Yeah.
You can't,
Yeah, in order to function. Okay, yep, that is true because they're in the middle of nowhere.
And the usage
and the
is
lighting
crazy.
that has to, although they may not have the
generators,
the whole nine, backup power, and and control centers. They got to have monitoring and so forth. Like you mentioned, the security. So it's just there's quite a bit that goes into, and not even considering the fact that a lot of these prisons are old. So the appliances that they might have are the say like the lights and so forth that they might use are likely not up to speed when you consider the energy efficiency, right? So yeah.
Well, and
now, do they get into what type of energy they're using?
yeah,
or,
so there are some
you know
projects in California to build more efficient prisons, like with LEED certifications, where the windows are a bit more efficient, right? So they're just trying to reduce it by about 50% with that LEED certification. So it's a higher standard, right? In Butner Federal Prison in North Carolina, that they have a qualified LEED status prison. I think that was back in 2005, right? So that was $98 million to do it as a green prison, right? So you got to figure out they have a huge footprint, right? And so when you think about their carbon footprint, the concrete that they use, right? We know what that's pushing out, but there is other implications to the recidivism, right, of the inmates. How do we keep them from not coming back? A lot of that happens where they will call, for lack of a better word, they'll get another case while they are already in prison, where there's some sort of altercation with a guard or another inmate. And so a study was done to look at if you make the prison more nature friendly, meaning making it greener, there's a calming aspect to that. Being in nature, we know, has natural effects, which could help reduce the number of additional infractions that happen while in prison, to reduce that number. So there may be an opportunity to green the older locations, right? So that's one idea.
That gets into a whole other topic. That do they really want to stop them from coming back? But that's a whole other
see, and that's the perspective I look at it as well, Latif, is that like
that's what it is.
You consider some of the opportunities that we would try to push is around exposing our youth and college students to renewables and what's happening with the grid and so forth, just that knowledge so that they can pursue, some of those careers, some of those businesses, because there are economic opportunities when you consider, the energy and the way energy is growing, or I should say the renewable energy market is growing. And so my thought is like, man, why not, if we're really talking about correctional or rehabilitating, when you think about what those words mean, are we really willing and on board to, help expose some of these inmates to these opportunities so that they don't return, so that they are equipped for, these opportunities when they're released, and they can now be not just trying to find whatever job to make ends meet, but they can actually come out a little bit more productive than what they went in, and now they won't go back. But that question still remains to be answered. Like you said, is that really the motive to not bring them back? Because it is a business, and all business have operating expenses.
True story.
They want bigger budgets.
Oh,
always.
Wow. Yeah.
Always.
Unfortunately, for this case.
Man, that's very powerful conversation. We're going to definitely have to revisit this conversation in regard to prison and really what could be done to better the conditions, better the rehabilitation of inmates in prison. So we're going to have to revisit that, Shalay, I'm telling you, because I'm sure we all know somebody, or who has experience or might even still be in the prison system, and it's something that has certainly impacted our communities on a great level. And so, but now it's time for the real fun segment where Shalay gets the chance to break us off with some things. And so, go ahead, Shalay. It's our fun fact segment. and I'm looking forward to it. Okay, let's hear it.
Okay. So, LeBron, have you ever done, like, when you're on vacation in warmer climates, you'll swim with dolphins? Have you ever done that?
Negative. I've seen people do it, but negative for me.
So I've never done it either, but I have some friends that have done it. But you know that, like, wild animals don't practice safe sex, right? I think we learned that in the last episode. That there's a lot of wild sex with chlamydia.
Yeah, apparently, yeah.
So did you know that Atlantic falls dolphins actually get genital warts? Yeah. So just in case you want to with them,
Jesus.
just know that some of them could certainly have genital warts. It's a thing. That is the fun fact for today.
You know what? You gonna steer some people away from animals with these types of facts. And maybe they should be away from the animals. You know, swimming with the dolphin. And the next thing you know, you get back to your room or get back home, and
it gets you real.
That would be messed up, and somebody would be asking. I was just about to say somebody gonna be asking some questions like, "What in the world is going on around here?" You know, and who would even turn to the excuse? Well, I was swimming with the dolphins. No, that's not. That's not even a reasonable minded excuse when you hear of a situation like that. You know, so.
I'm glad you called it a situation because that is what it is. If that's what you decide to do for an excuse, let me tell you. But I thought it was interesting. There are plenty of other wild animals that have venereal diseases, STIs, or what have you. So just be mindful when you play in the wild. You might come back with something.
Lord, yeah, being wild, you're going to catch what the wild got is. In other words, what you're saying. Listen, folks, y'all be careful around these animals. I know we like to go vacating in Cancun, Mexico, and all these other places where dolphins, frequent, and they have little exercises where you can swim like you just talked about. Y'all be careful around these doggone animals because you could catch a case with your significant other. I put it that way. I think that's the moral of hearing what this particular this fact is. You know what I mean? Genital warts on dolphins. Lord help us, Jesus. All right. Shalay, that was another good one. I'm just put it that way. That was another good one. Yeah, that was another good one. All right, y'all. So we have had a real great conversation around namesake. What's your namesake? You know, understanding the origin of your name and so forth. And I think it's such a rich conversation. Our call, as we did in our first episode, we're not going to leave this episode without, giving everybody a call to action. It's all about, it's not all about what we talk about. It's also what we do. Right. And so, our call is research your name, research what your name means, research where your name comes from. I challenge anybody, just, understand better about, where your, let's put last name over here. Number one, do you know what your first name means, where it comes from, why you would name that? What does your middle name mean? But then also, what is the origin of your last name? And I know I've done some research on the coat of arms for my last name, as we talked about with Baxter, the coat of arms. That's a very medieval concept. And so, if you never looked up your last name and understood what country of origin your last name goes back to, of course, for us who were brought over here, we're likely going to trace our last names back to whatever last name was associated with the farm or plantation that our ancestors worked on. But it's still it's I think it's important information to know about, and so we encourage you to do some research, do some thorough research on your name and understand what your namesake is. how you have arrived at all the names that you do have, first, middle, last, and even nickname. Very important stuff. I know that, in ancient times, I shouldn't even say ancient, but, in a lot of customs, there was always a story being told with a name. And sometimes this Western culture and what we've adopted, we're not always doing the same thing, but I do think that, there's always a unique story, regardless of if the namer or those who were naming us were trying to do that or not. I still think there's always an interesting story to be told. So we encourage you, we challenge you, do some more research on your name, have a better understanding of what that means.
Well, thank you for joining us today. Please support us by following us on YouTube, subscribing, tell your friends about it. We hope that we brought your energy up today. Look for the next episode on October 19th.